Välkommen allesammans. Today I'm going to be looking at a little gameplay footage here and also talking about the difference in appearance between the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons and what that would be like in real life. So in TV shows and movies and games, we see the Vikings as these big, tall, blonde, beastly specimens, and they just tower over the puny, weak English. But that is actually not true at all. The Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings, they would not have looked very different at all in real life. First of all, Anglo-Saxons were not actually English at all. They were just two groups of tribes called the Angles and the Saxons. And as you see here, they were originally from Denmark or southern Germany area. Now they started migrating in massive numbers and eventually were in the dominant population in most of England, but before that, the people living in the British Isles were all Celtic. And even the Celts were described as looking quite Nordic from most of the sources that we have, being either a redhead or a blonde with bright blue eyes, fair skin. Yes, when the Romans came in, right around the 1st century AD, there would have been some mixing, there would have been some Roman DNA, there would have been a little bit darker hair and skin and eye genetics in there for a while in the British Isles, but not in super large numbers. Then, in the 4th century, Rome fell, and they basically pulled out of the British Isles and were left to the Celts to themselves. Then the Anglo-Saxons at that time came in massive numbers, and they basically took over England. So you get a big mix of the Celts, who looked probably something like this, and then the Anglo-Saxons, who looked something like this. And these people living here now in England, the Anglo-Saxons, they spoke a Germanic language and worshipped the Germanic gods. They worshipped Thor and Odin and all of those others in England for at least 200 to 300 years before Christianity finally came in. Then, a few hundred years later, that's when the Vikings first came. There would basically be no difference in the way they both look at that time. Yes, the English would have been a little bit different. They would have been Christian now for a couple hundred years and developed a different language and culture by the time the Vikings came in. But there really would not have been much difference in the way that they looked. Really, the Danish Vikings coming to England in the 800s, meeting the Anglo-Saxons, it was really just like they were meeting their cousins from about 300 years ago. Maybe they had the same great-great-great-great-grandparents, probably like 10 or 15 generations back. Really not that long. So as far as the height difference, that's one thing that people talk about a lot. So the average Vikings found in the archaeological digs, they were only about 175 tall. But the English, they were about 170 tall from the archaeological finds we see. So it's a very small difference, just about 5 centimeters or 2 inches. And most historians attribute to that as just a little difference in the nutrition, that the Scandinavians maybe had a little better nutrition at that time. But it is true in many of the chronicles and accounts about the Vikings from other places in the world that the Vikings were very tall. We see that in a lot of records. But that's probably because it was the tall ones that were the warriors that they came in contact with. The warriors were mostly nobles and freemen. So these men would have been a lot taller than the slaves or just regular workers that stayed home in Scandinavia. So the ones that the Anglo-Saxons encountered were probably a lot taller than the average Anglo-Saxon, but there were still many tall Anglo-Saxons too. Most of them were warriors, probably. Don't forget, the people who are writing down all these records that we have from medieval times and before were wimpy Christian priests and historians, and of course the warriors probably would have been way tall for all of them. Just had to clear that up, that the people living in the British Isles probably would have looked quite Nordic, actually, and similar to the Vikings, just like a lot of other people living in Europe at the time, honestly. Not anymore today, but back then, they would have probably all looked like big, blonde, beautiful cousins, and some of them being redheaded. So I hope you learned something about that. Looking forward to playing the game. Vi ses nästa gång.